From getting killed by a bowl of fruit, to shooting yourself in court just to prove a point, to literally being strangled by your own invention. This is how some of the most powerful and famous figures in American history met their end. Spoiler alert, while some died on the battlefield or in their sleep, others died in ways that are almost impossible to believe. History books usually focus on their heroic deeds, their speeches, and their wars. But today, we are focusing on the moments they would probably like you to forget. Let's start with one of the most famous men in America, a founding father who survived wars and revolutions, only to be taken down by a whalebone. Yes, you heard that right, a whalebone. Gouverneur Morris is not a household name like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, but he was absolutely essential to the birth of the United States. He signed the Articles of Confederation, he signed the U.S. Constitution, and he was widely considered the most eloquent speaker of his time. He was a brilliant man, a ladies' man who actually lost a leg in a carriage accident, though rumors swirled that he broke it jumping out of a window to escape a jealous husband. He was a survivor. He navigated the treacherous politics of the French Revolution and the American founding era. But in 1816, at the age of 64, Morris faced a problem that no amount of political skill could solve. He suffered from a blockage in his urinary tract. In the early 19th century, urology was practically non-existent. There were no advanced surgeries, no lasers, and certainly no sterile catheters. The pain was excruciating. Morris was desperate. He was a man of action, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. In a moment of pure desperation, he grabbed a piece of whalebone, specifically a piece of baleen from a corset, and attempted to use it as a homemade catheter to clear the blockage himself. It is hard to imagine the agony and the sheer grit it took to attempt such a procedure on oneself. Tragically, but perhaps predictably, this did not go well. The whalebone caused severe internal injuries and introduced a massive infection. Instead of relieving the pressure, he created a wound that his body could not heal. He developed a horrific infection and died a slow, painful death shortly after. It was a shocking end for a man who had helped write the Constitution. He penned the preamble, "We the People," but he died because of a piece of a whale. If you think that is bad, the next story involves a man who talked himself to death. Literally. This brings us to William Henry Harrison, the 9th President of the United States. Harrison was a war hero. He earned the nickname Old Tippecanoe for his victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe. He ran a campaign based on being a tough, rugged frontiersman who lived in a log cabin and drank hard cider. He won the election of 1840 comfortably, but Harrison had a chip on his shoulder. His critics called him Granny Harrison and claimed he was too old and senile to lead the country. He was 68 years old, which at the time made him the oldest president ever elected. He was determined to prove everyone wrong. He wanted to show the world that he was strong, vital, and energetic. So, on his inauguration day, March 4th, 1841, Harrison made a fateful decision. The weather in Washington, D.C. was terrible. It was freezing cold, windy, and raining. A sensible person would have worn a coat, a hat, and perhaps kept their speech short. Harrison did none of those things. He refused to wear an overcoat or a hat. He wanted to look tough. Then he began to speak. And speak. And speak. Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in American history. It was 8,445 words long. It took him nearly 2 hours to read it aloud in the freezing rain. He went on and on about Roman history and political theory while the crowd shivered. He was proving his stamina, but he was also sealing his fate. For over a century, the story went that Harrison caught a cold that day, which turned into pneumonia and killed him. It was the ultimate irony. The man who wanted to prove he wasn't too old and weak died because he tried too hard to look young and strong. However, modern analysis suggests an even more embarrassing cause of death. It turns out, Harrison didn't get sick immediately after the speech. He fell ill 3 weeks later. Researchers now believe his death wasn't caused by the cold rain, but by the White House water supply. In the 1840s, the White House didn't have modern plumbing. Its water came from a spring located just 7 blocks away from a depository for night soil, a polite term for human waste. Essentially, the president's drinking water was contaminated with raw sewage. Harrison likely died of enteric fever or typhoid caused by drinking poop water. His doctors, trying to save him, made things much worse. They gave him opium, castor oil, and enemas, which only dehydrated him further. He died just 31 days into his term. He served the shortest presidency in history, all because of a long speech and bad plumbing. It is a cautionary tale about ego and infrastructure. But Harrison wasn't the only president to die from what he consumed. This brings us to Zachary Taylor, the 12th president, and the infamous death by cherries. Zachary Taylor was another war hero. He was a general known as Old Rough and Ready. He was tough, disheveled, and had never voted in an election until he voted for himself. He was not a polished politician. On July 4th, 1850, Taylor attended a massive Independence Day celebration at the Washington Monument. It was a scorching hot day. The sun was beating down and the humidity was stifling. After sitting through hours of speeches, Taylor returned to the White House exhausted and dehydrated. To cool down, he decided to indulge in a snack. He ate a large bowl of raw cherries and washed it down with copious amounts of iced milk. Now, in 1850, pasteurization did not exist. Refrigeration was primitive. The milk was likely teeming with bacteria, and the cherries may have been washed in contaminated water, perhaps the same contaminated water that killed Harrison a decade earlier. That night, Taylor fell violently ill. He developed severe stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. His doctors, true to the medical standards of the time, sprang into action with cures that were essentially torture. They dosed him with calomel, a mercury-based compound, and opium. They blistered his skin and bled him. For 5 days, the President of the United States lay in agony, fighting a battle his stomach couldn't win. On July 9th, he told his wife, "I am about to die. I expect the summons soon." He passed away shortly after. The official cause was cholera morbus, a term used for severe gastroenteritis. Essentially, the president ate some bad fruit and milk, and it killed him. For years, conspiracy theorists believed he was poisoned by pro-slavery Southerners. But when his body was exhumed in the 1990s, tests showed no arsenic. It really was just the cherries. A tough general who survived bullets and cannon fire was taken out by a dessert. Speaking of food and drink, let's talk about a death that is less about what was consumed and more about a temper tantrum. This is the story of Jack Daniel. Yes, that Jack Daniel. The man whose name is on millions of whiskey bottles around the world. Jack Daniel was a successful distiller in Lynchburg, Tennessee. One morning in 1911, he arrived at work early. He needed to access some documents in his safe. However, Jack had a notoriously bad memory for combinations. He tried one combination. It didn't work. He tried another. It didn't work. He tried again and again, getting more frustrated by the second. Finally, in a fit of rage, he kicked the heavy metal safe as hard as he could. He broke his toe. Now, a broken toe is painful, but it usually isn't fatal. However, Jack Daniel ignored the injury. He didn't clean it properly, and he didn't see a doctor immediately. The toe became infected. The infection turned into gangrene. The gangrene spread up his leg. Doctors eventually amputated the leg, but it was too late. The infection had entered his bloodstream. Jack Daniel died from complications of blood poisoning. He built an empire of whiskey, but he died because he couldn't remember a password and lost his temper. The safe, by the way, is still there in the distillery. It is a silent reminder that patience is a virtue, and kicking heavy metal objects is never a good idea. Sometimes the embarrassment comes not from the victim, but from the people trying to save them. This brings us to the tragic and infuriating death of President James Garfield. James Garfield was a brilliant man. He was ambivalent, a scholar, and could write Latin with one hand while writing Greek with the other. He had only been president for a few months when, on July 2nd, 1881, he was shot by a disgruntled office seeker named Charles Guiteau. Guiteau shot Garfield in the back at a train station in Washington, D.C. One bullet grazed his arm, but the other lodged in his back, behind the pancreas. It was a serious wound, but by modern standards, and even by the standards of the late 19th century, if handled correctly, it was survivable. The bullet had missed his spine and major organs. The problem was the doctors. As soon as Garfield hit the floor, a dozen doctors rushed to the scene. One by one, they inserted their unwashed, unsterilized fingers into the bullet wound to try and find the slug. This was before the acceptance of germ theory in America. Joseph Lister had already pioneered antiseptic surgery in Europe, but American doctors were stubborn. They thought invisible germs were nonsense. They poked and prodded him with dirty hands and dirty instruments. They turned a 3-inch wound into a 20-inch infected canal filled with pus. But the absurdity didn't end there. They became obsessed with finding the bullet, believing they had to remove it for him to survive. Enter Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. Bell wanted to help. He quickly invented a metal detector to locate the bullet inside the president's body. It was a brilliant idea. He brought the device to the White House and tested it on Garfield. But the machine gave confusing readings. It hummed everywhere. Bell was baffled. He tried again and again, but he couldn't pinpoint the bullet. It turns out the doctors had placed Garfield on a brand new invention, a coil spring mattress. The metal springs in the bed were confusing the metal detector. Bell asked if there was metal in the bed, and the doctors, seemingly unaware of how beds worked, said no. So the metal detector failed. The doctors continued to probe the wound. Garfield lingered for 80 days. He wasted away from 210 pounds to just 130 pounds. He was essentially starving and rotting to death. His final days were a nightmare of pus-filled abscesses and extreme pain. When he finally died in September, the autopsy revealed that the bullet had formed a protective cyst and was sitting harmlessly in his body. If the doctors had simply cleaned the wound, bandaged it, and left him alone, James Garfield likely would have survived. At his trial, the assassin Charles Guiteau famously said, "The doctors killed Garfield. I just shot him." And honestly, he was right. It is one of the most frustrating and embarrassing chapters in American medical history. From medical incompetence to legal absurdity, let's look at the death of Clement Vallandigham. He wasn't a president, but he was a prominent politician and lawyer during the Civil War era. He was a Copperhead, a Northerner who opposed the war, and he was known for being dramatic. In 1871, Vallandigham was defending a man named Thomas McGeeheen, who was accused of shooting a man named Tom Myers during a bar fight. Vallandigham's defense theory was bold. He claimed the victim, Tom Myers, had accidentally shot himself while drawing his pistol from a kneeling position. To prove this was possible, Vallandigham decided to demonstrate the action to his fellow lawyers in his hotel room. He took a pistol, which he believed to be unloaded, and put it in his pocket. He then simulated the motion of drawing the gun and snagging the trigger on his clothing. The demonstration worked perfectly. Too perfectly. The gun was loaded. Vallandigham shot himself in the stomach. He looked at his stunned colleagues and said, "I have shot myself." He died the next day from peritonitis. But here's the twist. His client, Thomas McGeeheen, was acquitted. The jury decided that if the lawyer could accidentally shoot himself demonstrating the theory, then the victim surely could have done the same. Clement Vallandigham won his case, but he paid for it with his life. It is the ultimate case of a lawyer being too committed to his argument. While we are on the topic of accidental self-destruction, we have to talk about Thomas Midgley Jr. You might not know his name, but you know his work. He is often described as the man who had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history, and not in a good way. Midgley invented two things: leaded gasoline and CFCs, Freon. Leaded gas poisoned generations of people, and CFCs destroyed the ozone layer. He was a brilliant chemist with a knack for dangerous inventions. In 1940, Midgley contracted polio, which left him severely disabled and confined to his bed. He was frustrated by his loss of mobility, so, using his engineering mind, he designed a complex system of ropes and pulleys to help him lift himself out of bed. One morning in 1944, the system malfunctioned. Midgley became entangled in the ropes of his own invention. He was strangled to death by the machine he built to save himself. It was a dark, poetic end for a man whose inventions had unknowingly strangled the planet. Let's pivot back to the White House for a moment, because the embarrassment didn't stop in the 19th century. Let's talk about the 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt. Wait, you say, Teddy Roosevelt? The man who got shot in the chest and kept speaking? The man who explored the Amazon? He died a hero's death, right? Well, yes and no. Roosevelt was undeniably a badass, but his post-presidency expedition to the Amazon River, the River of Doubt, was a disaster that essentially destroyed his body. He went on this trip not for science, but because he was sulking after losing the election of 1912. He was 55 years old, overweight, and not in condition for the jungle. During the trip, he cut his leg on a rock. The leg became infected. He contracted malaria. He was delirious with fever, begging his son to leave him behind to die. He lost 50 pounds. He survived the trip, but he never really recovered. He spent his final years plagued by inflammatory rheumatism and abscesses. He died in his sleep at 60. While dying in your sleep isn't embarrassing, the fact that he essentially wrecked his own health because he was bored and angry about an election result is a reminder that even the toughest men have fragile egos. But if we are talking about fragility, we must mention the death of the famous magician Harry Houdini. Houdini was the world's greatest escape artist. He escaped from handcuffs, straitjackets, water torture cells, and buried coffins. He seemed invincible. In 1926, Houdini was in his dressing room in Montreal. A university student named J. Gordon Whitehead came in and asked Houdini if it was true that he could withstand any punch to the stomach. Houdini, who prided himself on his physical strength, said yes. But before Houdini could tighten his abdominal muscles to prepare, Whitehead smashed him in the gut multiple times. Houdini was in agony, but he played it cool. He performed his show that night despite being in excruciating pain. He traveled to Detroit for his next show, collapsing on stage. He had a ruptured appendix. Now, doctors today debate whether the punch caused the rupture or if he already had appendicitis and the punch just made it worse. Either way, Houdini refused to stop the show until it was too late. He died of peritonitis on Halloween. The man who could escape anything couldn't escape a punch from a college student and his own stubbornness. Sometimes, death comes from a simple, tiny mistake. This is the story of Tennessee Williams, one of America's greatest playwrights, the man who wrote A Streetcar Named Desire and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. In 1983, Williams was found dead in his hotel room in New York City. For years, the story was that he had choked to death on the cap of a bottle of eye drops. The report stated that he liked to tilt his head back to put drops in his eyes, and he would hold the cap in his teeth. In a freak accident, the cap slipped down his throat and choked him. It sounded like the most unlucky, absurd death imaginable. A literary giant taken out by a piece of plastic. However, later reports suggested that drugs and alcohol played a major role, suppressing his gag reflex. But the image of the eye drop cap remains one of the most bizarre footnotes in literary history. Let's go back to the Civil War era for one of the most ironic military deaths. General John Sedgwick was a Union general. At the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in 1864, his men were under fire from Confederate sharpshooters. The soldiers were ducking and dodging, trying to stay alive. Sedgwick was annoyed by their fear. He stood tall and shouted, "Why are you dodging like this? They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." Seconds later, a bullet struck him under the left eye, killing him instantly. He is the highest-ranking Union officer killed in the Civil War. His final words were literally mocking the enemy's aim, right before they proved him wrong. It is a grim reminder that you should never tempt fate on a battlefield. And speaking of tempting fate, we have the story of Allan Pinkerton. You know the name, the Pinkerton Detective Agency. He was the most famous private eye in American history. He saved Abraham Lincoln from an assassination plot in Baltimore. He hunted down outlaws like Jesse James. He was a man who lived dangerously. But how did he die? In 1884, Pinkerton was walking down the sidewalk in Chicago. He slipped, bit his tongue, and fell. It seems like a minor injury, but like Jack Daniel and his toe, Pinkerton's tongue became infected. Gangrene set in. The world's greatest detective, a man who faced down killers and spies, died because he bit his own tongue. It sounds like a joke, but it is 100% true. Now let's look at a president who didn't die in office, but whose death was a result of his own stubborn silence. Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal. He was known for saying very little. There is a famous story that a woman at a dinner party bet him she could get him to say more than 2 words. He looked at her and said, "You lose." Coolidge died of a sudden heart attack in 1933, but his death highlighted just how quiet and unassuming he was. When the news broke, the famous writer Dorothy Parker reportedly asked, "How can they tell?" It was a savage burn. He was so inactive and silent that people joked they couldn't distinguish his living state from his dead state. But perhaps the most tragic, embarrassing death belongs to a man who wasn't president, but an inventor who changed the way we listen to music. Thaddeus Cahill. He invented the telharmonium, the first electronic musical instrument. It was a massive machine weighing 200 tons. It was the grandfather of the synthesizer. But the machine was too big, too expensive, and it interfered with telephone lines. It was a failure. But the real embarrassment is how forgotten he is. He died in obscurity. However, contrast that with the inventor of the Segway, Jimmy Heselden. Heselden didn't invent the Segway, but he bought the company. He was a millionaire philanthropist. In 2010, he was riding an off-road version of the Segway near his estate in Yorkshire. He lost control and drove the scooter off a cliff. He fell 80 feet into a river and died. The owner of the company that made self-balancing scooters died because he lost his balance and fell off a cliff. The irony is almost too much to handle. Let's bring it back to the presidents to close this out. We talked about Washington earlier, but we need to revisit the sheer absurdity of his medical treatment. It wasn't just bloodletting. The details are horrifying. When Washington woke up with a sore throat, he asked for a mixture of molasses, vinegar, and butter. He couldn't swallow it and nearly choked. His overseer bled him. Then the doctors arrived. They applied cantharides, dried beetles, to his throat to cause blisters, thinking this would draw out the bad humors. They gave him an enema. They made him gargle vinegar and sage tea. They bled him 4 times. In the last bleeding, they took 32 ounces of blood. That is a quart of blood. The average human body has about 5 quarts. They drained 20% of his blood in one sitting, after draining more earlier. Washington didn't die of a sore throat. He died of hypovolemic shock. He was murdered by the best medical minds in America. And the most embarrassing part? One young doctor, Elisha Dick, suggested a radical new procedure, a tracheotomy. He wanted to cut a small hole in Washington's windpipe to let him breathe. The older doctors mocked him and said it was too dangerous. If they had listened to the young guy, Washington might have lived. Instead, they stuck to their medieval torture methods. It proves that sometimes expert opinion is just a fancy way of saying, we've always done it this way, so let's keep doing it until he dies. And finally, we have to mention the death of Vice President Elbridge Gerry. He is the man who gave us the term gerrymandering because he redrew voting districts to look like a salamander. Gerry was elderly and frail when he was vice president under James Madison. On his way to the Senate, he decided to visit a merchant. He suffered a hemorrhage in his lungs and collapsed. He was taken to a nearby boarding house where he died. What makes this slightly embarrassing? He died completely broke. He had mismanaged his money so badly that he left his family with nothing. Congress actually had to pass a bill to pay for his funeral because his estate couldn't afford it. The second most powerful man in America was destitute. It was a chaotic end for a man whose name is synonymous with political manipulation. So, what do these stories teach us? They teach us that death is the great equalizer. You can be the leader of the free world, a genius inventor, or a war hero, but you are still made of flesh and bone. You can be taken out by a cherry, a dirty finger, a safe, or a glass of water. It is a reminder that while these men are frozen in statues and printed on money, they were human. They made mistakes. They had egos. They refused to wear coats in the rain. They ate things they shouldn't have, and they trusted doctors they really, really shouldn't have. History is often written as a series of great events, but it is also a series of accidents. If Harrison hadn't drunk the water, he might have changed the course of the slavery debate. If Garfield hadn't been poked by dirty fingers, he might have reformed the civil service earlier. If Washington had gotten a tracheotomy, he might have served a third term or guided the nation differently in his final years. These embarrassing deaths shaped the country just as much as the heroic ones. They led to plumbing reforms, better Secret Service protection eventually, and a slow, painful acceptance of germ theory. So the next time you feel embarrassed about tripping in public or saying the wrong thing in a meeting, just remember, at least you didn't die because you wanted to prove you could eat a bowl of cherries. At least you didn't let a lawyer shoot himself to prove a point. And at least you aren't being bled by your own doctors. Life is fragile. History is weird. And sometimes the most powerful people in the world go out not with a bang, but with a hiccup. And that is how the mighty fall. From soup comments to paralyzed sides, from water requests to silence. These final moments, no matter how strange, are the last acts of the American drama.